Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. We all know that art interacts with social change in a multitude of ways. Many times it drives social change and it often allows us to express the complexities of our reality in a language that is universal. But it's also equally important to discuss and understand how times of social change impact the arts and the artists, especially in a time like the one we have been experiencing this year, the pandemic. So let's jump into our conversation and see how art has been impacted by and has impacted the times we are living through today. Joining us for conversation is Mr. Emmanel Lovati Kintu, who is the CEO at Met Images, a creative art company. Their main focus is on the field of commercial photography, design, and motion. He joins us from Milan. Also joining us today is Shoaib Iqbal, who's an arts manager who has worked also as a curator, director, and arts educator, and he is the founder of The Little Art, a non-profit arts education organization that uses art to promote positive social values through innovative learning opportunities among children and young adults, especially the marginalized. He joins us from Lahore. Thank you both for joining us and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Emmanel and Shoaib, you both interact and engage with art in two very different but unique ways nonetheless. Talking about the pandemic and how it's impacted the work you both do. Take us through it. Emmanel, let's begin with you.
As a professional photographer, we have interacted with the community in different ways. The society has been affected by the pandemic. How did we make contribution to this? First of all, for a case in Uganda, we are the first people to make a video that tells people how to control, how not to panic about the pandemic, and how to protect themselves. This video, we submitted it to various sectors in Uganda. People will understand more when they see something visual, other than telling somebody verbally reading. A number of people don't read, but when somebody sees a video or a painting that tells a story, makes someone to understand better the cause and the cause of the pandemic, how to prevent it, and how to stay alive.
Right. Emmanel, stay with me. I'm going to take that same question to Shoaib. Shoaib, you work in a very particularly unique and exciting and important foundation which works to engage children with art, and often children from marginalized communities. How has this pandemic impacted your work?
One of the immediate impacts that we had was cutting down our events and exhibitions. So it started in March when we had to cut down our national tour of child art exhibitions. So we had to cut down Karachi but we already had an event in Lahore and Islamabad. And in that project, nearly 20,000 children participated through their artwork, and we showcased their artwork through exhibitions. And then at that time, we were working on curating our 12th Lahore International Children's Film Festival as well. So it was the work that we were doing it from our offices, and our team worked on this from their homes. In the pandemic, we thought that how we can engage children and young people through creating artworks, writing stories, and taking photos from their vicinity and homes. So we launched a project which we called it Staying at Home, Let's Create. And nearly 5,000 children responded to that in about 6 weeks. And we showcased some of the work in online exhibitions. And then we took our Artbeat project, which is about 11-year-old, to creating directly the works about how the COVID-19 is impacting children and young people from different aspects. We wanted to talk about what they're experiencing and seeing, but also we had one theme as part of it, that memories from the past and hopes for the future. So children, reacted to that and created artworks that will be showcased online, and we are working on that. Last bit of our work is that our national tour of Children's Film Festival that we organize every year happens in cinemas, is not happening, of course. So we took our Children's Film Festival online with the streaming service Stars Play. So Lahore International Children's Film Festival is happening online, and we have another kind of target. We used to reach about 50,000 children through physical events of the festival, but now we are hoping to reach about 5 million children who are sitting at home and possibly experiencing it on their screens. So this was our response as an organization, and we lost on few opportunities, but we tried to continue and created new opportunities as for children and young people as creators, but also as viewers. A bit of our work was engaging children online through film and cinema. So our jury this year, we have 178 children from across the country, few from other 4 countries as well, who are acting as a young jury for the festival along with the senior jury of filmmakers. So they are also engaged online.
Right. Shoaib, it sounds like you guys had a massive transformation. You guys had to bring in so much innovation in order to keep up with what was happening. And just listening to all the ways your organization responded to the pandemic, it really is a very heartwarming to hear. But let me ask you this. When we talk about children and their engagement with art and the need to do that, especially during such turbulence, such social turbulence, such uncertainty during this pandemic, did you see a change in how kids were engaging, responding to all that artwork?
I think majority of the artworks that we received was based on a certain degree of fear. If I'm about to analyze some of the work that they made, fear. So there was most of the images of viruses of different kind, but also thinking about medical staff and doctors who are fighting with it on the front lines. There was lots of appreciation as for doctors as heroes, and essentially also some children also, for example, painted flowers because we also talk to them about memories, and those memories are not just limited in the time you are as a child artist or as a young artist. You can actually jump in the future and the past. That's the beauty of the art experience as a creator. So if we, but then once it's also very futuristic in terms of the way when children are realizing a new world where they are looking at some of the works that were created as part of the COVID experience and sitting at home. They are thinking that the world has more green, it has more flowers, it has more, opportunities in terms of close to nature. There is less pollution. So we also identified all of these themes where we thought that children should be looking at the positive side of it and how they can process this experience and trauma, I would say, at this stage. So yes, there was identifying issues and reacting to it, and very bleak and a picture that is based on fear, but also there's a great degree of color, a great degree of hope, and also realizing that what are the priorities in terms of the world, in terms of the way we are living in this world.
Right. Emmanel, let's dig deep into what Shoaib said from your angle and the artists you're working with, and talk about this element of fear that has become very universal throughout these past 7 to 8 months. How have the artists you work with, the ones you interact with, how have they creatively dealt with this emotion?
Well, to start with, we also have what we call the classes for the children for photography. I was more impressed. Yes, the children, we are more disappointed they cannot go back to school. But when we decide to do this, with art, we are able to discover the talents of various children. For example, the children now, we have a 10-year-old boy who has become more amazing when it comes to photography. Every day he has to do something unique. This is an impact. Yes, we have the pandemic, but this pandemic has already helped people to discover themselves, discover new talent and self-esteem, and how to live the community. Dealing with the people I work with, yes, a number of people were so much affected. The company alone ours was affected, but we try to go a little bit wider. Somebody will say, create the box. I mean, look outside the box, but you cannot look outside the box when you have not created the box. Create the box, go in the box, and look outside. So that's how we manage to deal with the people. People felt negative. For example, we could do an advert for the hotel, but most of our assignments were cancelled because they cannot do it. But we told them, please, let's continue doing this work. As when the situation normalizes, we can come back and do the final bit of it. So with this, we try to engage various people, various hotels, and the tour companies that we work with, our students, and the entire staff.
Right.
I know it's still a challenge.
Emmanel, if I could just interject here and ask you one last question that's very important, is that when you talk about how this time also allowed individuals to discover themselves, do you think some amount of social turbulence is in fact necessary to accelerate that creative process or to tap into a different energy?
A parent may decide to say, oh, my child is good at this. But what does the child be interested in? So with this, we just said, whoever wants to come, is free of charge, come and study, then we shall be working with you. So several children came, and then they had self-discovered. They are beginning to know, oh, how come I didn't know that I can do this? They are beginning to see.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Emmanel, Lovati, Kintu, for joining us from Milan and sharing your perspective with us. Shoaib, let me talk to you about this educational perspective and when it involves art and how it's being impacted right now. And in fact, how children are engaging with this. Now, your work talks specifically about critical engagement with art and how art allows a space in doing that which often conventional schooling doesn't allow. How important do you think critical engagement is for children during times of social upheaval and the types of social issues we're seeing right now?
Thank you very much for asking this question, because this is the question that we answer in several ways to parents and teachers and our audiences. I think art actually facilitates you to ask questions and seek answers of those questions in a very systematic way. For example, I'll give you an example, because the way any art form is structured, it helps children and young people to be part of a journey which is sometimes self-guided, and sometimes there are people who are mentoring you as a teacher or senior artist. But the way it is designed, it helps you to ask questions at a very core of it. For example, if you want to paint trees, you need to question, what kind of tree and what are you choosing, and then what kind of green, if there is a green at all, and then all of these possibilities. So it's all about going into one particular question and exploring all of its options. The way our conventional education system works is that it actually asks you in the exam that what you know in terms of a particular information, or what do you know about any facts that can be memorized, because most of in Pakistan's education system is on memorizing and rote learning. So the purpose of being, leading our children and young people through arts is that they would be asking questions and explore that there is no particular one set of answers to any realities of the world around us. A black color can be a black in a situation and has one meaning, and the same color can have another meaning in the same in any other cultural context. So it's all about possibilities, and I think these are the skills that you need to navigate in a world that is has become so global increasingly. And also, when children and young people are out of school, they need these skills where there is no absolute reality, where there is no singular truth. And the way we talk about peace, for example, or the way we talk about rights, or so there is no one truth, and this is something that art teaches us.
Right. On that point, I'd also like to introduce Professor Carol Becker, who is the Dean of Faculty and Professor of the Arts at Columbia University School of the Arts. She's also the author of several books, including The Invisible Drama, Women and Anxiety of Change. And she is also a member of the Global Agenda Council on the Role of Art in Society for the World Economic Forum. She joins us from New York. Now, talking about how important art is for critical thinking, let's hear your take on how important it is in higher education, especially when we see shrinking spaces for dissent in political realms in several countries. How important is this as a form of expression and to engage with things politically and critically?
Actually, great. It's a great question, and you put it in a wonderful way. You know what? I'm an educator of artists, so I'm dealing with the next generation of artists all the time, and I'm watching them develop their process. And Shoaib said something very important, I think, which is that art is really about problem solving. It's about solving a problem that you actually yourself create, and you create the parameters, and you create the dimensions, and you create the context for it. It's a very particular kind of education. And in higher education, what is completely unique about educating artists is that there isn't just a body of knowledge which people have to internalize. And then once they've internalized, they get a chance to actually comment on it. You can have people at a very young age doing the most innovative, most exciting work because they're tapping into their own creativity, their own subjectivity. And there's almost no other outlet in contemporary society where the value is placed on the individual. And this is really important when you think about the collective, because what is a collective or a community of humans but the aggregate of all of these particular individuals? And the more that people understand what they need to live full, fruitful lives, the more that society will reflect that. So that development of that understanding really comes through understanding yourself. And art is really about the artist learning to understand what he or she or them are thinking at a given moment. So I'll just stop there and see if you want to add something. But at this moment in society, when there's so much to comment on and so much to challenge in terms of leadership, artists are really taking a lot of lead in being able to articulate those issues and give visual representation or theatrical representation or filmic representation to those ideas so that other people can see them mirrored back and reflected to them.
Right, such an important answer. Professor Becker, I want to put this to you, and I think parts of it will also be something Shoaib will be interested in answering. But first, I'll take it to you. When we talk about art as a form of expression and the need for it during such social turbulence, how important is it for those groups that have been marginalized from mainstream discourse, from mainstream channels?
It's a very big conversation happening in the US right now, that exact conversation, which is who is telling stories, how are they telling their stories, and who gets to tell their stories. So what's happening is this explosion of individual groups, and you saw it with Black Lives Matter in the US. I mean, it's very, very powerful. The stories of African American people in the US, the hidden stories, the stories that haven't been told, and the need to really transform institutions to allow those stories to be told in every form of art making. So what you're seeing now is both an explosion of political ideas, but explosion of the ideas of representation. How do you represent groups that have not been represented? How do you create spaces where they can be represented? And what are the forms of representation? And who controls the institutions which decide what are the legitimate forms of representation. So there's challenging of the museums, there's challenging of universities. At every level, the society is being questioned. And this is a really exciting but very turbulent, and in our country right now in the US, potentially very scary moment, because the forces of opposition to that freedom of expression are strong. Yeah.
Right. Shoaib, that is in fact something that is universal, that kind of resonates with each and every part of the world, that the freedom to express yourself freely, different ideas, that space is shrinking. So when we talk about marginalized groups being able to express themselves through art, do you think that medium for those groups is also something that is being snatched away?
I think yes and no. I'll explain why I say that. On snatched away, what we have seen on the importance of it, that who's telling whose story. For example, if you are working with a child from a school which is not a private school, as there's a huge divide in private and public schools in Pakistan, which means a child might be coming from an underprivileged background. But once they see their artwork in an art gallery or presented as part of a collection where we are not seeing from where children are coming from, but we are seeing what stories that they have to tell, which means it doesn't matter that you are studying in a particular school. It matters that what kind of art you have created, because you are going to be a part of an exhibition curated by possibly finest artists from Pakistan. So I think this is one way to do it, where we talk about issues from our lens, which is based on equal values, because we don't judge people based on other criteria that the society gives us. That is one. And second is that when we worked through film, for example, with children and young people, and our lens was gender, and we realized that if we are working with equal young women and young girls and young boys, it would not be fair, because it's the issue of gender-based violence, and women and young girls are more prone to it. So we worked with 80% of young girls and 20% of boys, because we wanted to actually tell stories of gender-based violence from a feminist perspective. So this is something that we do, but we try to actually give equal voices and equal platforms to all the narratives out there. In terms of being marginalized, I don't think that repression has all different forms and shapes. But I don't think if we are able to deal with voices in a way we are talking about equality, it kind of undermines that, and the narrative that these groups and young people telling becomes the central point of the conversation.
Right. Thank you so much, Shoaib Iqbal, for joining us and giving us such an important insight and perspective. And we really appreciate all the work you're doing. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we're going to continue with our conversation. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show, into a very interesting conversation about the role of art during times of social change and how social conditions impact art. Now joining us for this conversation is Professor Carol Becker, who is the Dean of Faculty and Professor of the Arts at Columbia University School of the Arts. She joins us from New York. She's also the author of several books, including The Invisible Drama, Women and the Anxiety of Change, and she's also a member of the Global Agenda Council on the Role of Art in Society for the World Economic Forum. Also joining us today is Professor Rebecca Zorach, who's a Mary Jane Crow Professor in Art and Art History at Northwestern University. She too has written many books, including Blood, Milk, Ink, and Gold, Abundance and Excesses in the French Renaissance. She joins us from Chicago. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Rebecca Zorach, I'd like to start this conversation off with you and talk about how art has been impacted throughout history when we talk about unprecedented circumstances and conditions, whether it being war, illnesses, pandemics, and something that we're seeing right now, just so we can understand how art is going to be shaped by the pandemic we're experiencing today.
Well, art has always responded to social circumstances. I mean, I think one thing that's important to note is that most of the historical art that we have or have access to is the product of elites or made for elites. But there always have been social movements that have had artists involved in them. The Russian Revolution, the French Revolution. Gustave Courbet in the Paris Commune in 1871 was involved in a radical effort to reshape society. So I think that you'll see. Of course, there are also people who can't make their art under the current circumstances, but I think there are kind of energies that are unleashed by these kinds of situations that are producing and will continue to produce a lot of creativity and a lot of engagement on the part of artists and art in social movements and in efforts at social justice and political change.
Right. Sir Rebecca Zorach, continuing from a conversation with Professor Carol Becker from the earlier segment and talking about how in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement has centered this very question of art just being for the elites and there being greater representation of a certain segment. Do you think that's changing?
I do think it's changing. I mean, I think there always have been efforts there's always been a huge amount of creativity from below. And I think that with technology, with the kind of ability of people to work in the streets, there's huge new opportunities for engagement on the part of artists. I think that social media has a really important role to play, and then things like street art, graffiti, murals really make a lot of ideas visible to larger numbers of people and can kind of help generate more creativity, more engagement on the part of more people. So I think there's the issue of audience, there's the issue of who gets to see art, and then there's also the issue of who gets to participate. And I think there's a kind of proliferation of forms and opportunities for participation that are new in this moment. I think protest has always produced creativity, and I think we're seeing a lot of just the Black Lives Matter graffiti murals all over the U.S. and all over the world, responding to the moment are I think just a really great development and something that's reaching a lot of people in really important ways.
Right, definitely. Professor Carol Becker, extending this conversation and talking more about how we can break art from just being an elitist interest or a space that is only occupied by a couple of people. I think it's important to also discuss how we can make art and certain types of art, not just street art, but other art that people like yourself have come to appreciate. How do we make those spaces accessible, more accessible?
I think that what's really important, and Rebecca's talking about it as well, is this notion of sort of decentering, that art, the way that museums were structured, the Eurocentrism of them initially, especially in the US, which is what I know the best, there's just this enormous challenge to what is the center and what is the periphery. And how do you get all of this art making and all of this thinking that's being made in all these other sectors of society? How do you put that front and center? And in order to do that, how do you transform institutions so that those doors open to all of this other art making that is there's so much and it's so interesting and it tells the story of society in so many layers. How do we bring that into the center so that there isn't this notion that there's only one thing which is considered important, and that's sort of has a Eurocentric orientation? How do we say all of this art making is important because all of it reflects history?
Right. Now, I hate to put both on the spot, but I think this is also an important conversation to be had, especially since you both are professors of very, very important universities. Professor Carol Becker, when we're talking about universities and art education, we do know that elite universities are often claimed to, practice gatekeeping when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to very important information. When we talk about art education, do you think there's hope to circumvent those barriers that are put up by elite institutions, and especially educational institutions?
I like to talk about the education of artists because that's what I do, which is different than when people think of art education, they think of how to, in a sort of populist sense, how do we make art accessible in terms of ideas. But, an art school really is creating the next generation of artists. What's really important about creating a really diverse environment there is that is the pipeline to what people are going to see in museums, what is going to become visible to the world. So it's really important that these institutions, like my institution, take really seriously who is coming to school, how are we supporting those students so that everyone has access, who has the ability to get into a program like the School of the Arts at Columbia, so that they can actually make it through and then enter into these worlds and bring these multiple perspectives. So the onus is really on these elite institutions. I'm in an Ivy League institution. I was for many years at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which is a standalone art school. It's a different kind of animal, actually, in terms of how it functions. But all of these institutions have to be able to hire diverse faculty so that there are multiple points of view and make it possible for students of color in the US and around the world who may not have access, or students who economically simply don't have access, to be able to come to these institutions. These are huge challenges, and they really are the future of public. If higher education is going to succeed, it's going to have to solve these problems.
Right. Professor Rebecca, your thoughts on what Professor Carol Becker just stated?
I mean, I think I would echo what she said. I think that the institutions of higher education and museums in the United States right now are really facing a reckoning that has to do with capitalism and, the idea of private educational institutions, as well as issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are very much on the table. And a lot of institutions are paying lip service to those, but not necessarily walking the walk. And I think that's something that they have to be held accountable to, that institutions, can offer, can make themselves more open in terms of the student populations they accept, but then they have to listen to what those students say and really let the students take the lead in certain ways. And I think that's something that we as professors have to be willing to do and listen to what our students are saying. Also think about alternative educational settings. And, I think people are thinking about setting up new schools, alternative schools, free schools. Those can't necessarily always take the place in terms of the current situation, in terms of the credentials that people are hoping to get in order to go out into the world. But I think they can be spaces that are in some ways more intellectually exciting and engaging and artistically exciting for the kinds of conversations that can be had there. So I think that there's both the need for transformation from within institutions, but maybe also the need for and the continuing existence and creation of new settings outside of the kind of mainstream institutions.
Right. Following from that point, Professor Rebecca Zorach, and talking about how important it is to allow those spaces to continue and flourish, something that's often put out as a very practical problem or a very practical concern is that while we see very high youth unemployment globally, taking these art degrees and trying to pursue them practically within society, what changes need to come within our society structures to allow those individuals to come and not just, express themselves, but actually make a living, actually be able to reap the benefits of those materially, which are just as important?
Yeah, I mean, I think, things like universal basic income and opportunities, fellowship opportunities for recent graduates. I think, there are many different things, on the institutional level, but then on the societal level that could shift to enable people to kind of continue, whether it's a career as an artist, or whether it's just to continue to infuse creativity into their daily lives and what they do in other areas of society. It's a very, very challenging situation economically right now in the United States. And I think that artists have a great role to play in terms of the possibilities of transformation of this society if we can get through the next few months, and also to kind of allow for the more people to be able to pursue careers as artists. So I think there's a lot going on, and it's a very difficult and challenging time. But I think that there's a lot of energy toward social transformation that artists have a major role to play in.
Right. Professor Carol Becker, you're in the Global Agenda Council on the Role of Art in Society for the World Economic Forum. I think this would also be a very important question to put to you. How can we practically support artists when they're trying to make a living off of their talent and off of something that they've learned through educational institutions or informally?
Yeah, the U.S. particularly is an enormously utilitarian society. It always has thought of art as very peripheral to its central core mission, and therefore, unlike European societies, which have provided for museums, have provided for artists, really do try to help economically support institutions that support art. The US is very difficult. You really have to earn everything. And if you don't believe that art is central to the human experience or to society, then the struggle of artists is even greater. But I think that one of the things I always feel strongly about is if artists are going to come to art schools and they're going to come to universities, it is on us at the university level to make sure that when they are with us, that we are really preparing them for the profession in the best way that we can. And I really agree totally with Rebecca's point about creating alternative structures. I think it's super important. It's always been important to the radicalness of ideas that there be structures that exist that are parallel, that eventually really come to influence the nature of the more established art institutions. Those things have to exist simultaneously, but It is our job to make sure that when students leave, they're prepared to succeed.
Right. I'm really pressed for right now, but I want to change gears radically here and put this one last question to both professors. Professor Carol Becker, I'll begin with you, and I think it's an important question to put given our political and social climate, the impact social media has had on art.
Yes, and I'm not the expert that I wish I were on social media, but and I'm going to stretch that definition also just to say something very important about what's happened during COVID, which is that artists have truly adapted to using all forms of technology and media to make available to a general population an enormous amount of work, whether it's in theater or in visual art, in writing. Have used the technology to say to people, here, we're giving you what we do. We're providing what you need right now, the spiritual and emotional reflection of humanity that you need right now because people are feeling so isolated. So one of the great triumphs of this horrible thing that's happened with this pandemic, one of the good things that's come from it is this popularization of art by using technology. So everyone, and the museums have done it too, they've just put everything online. They've given people access to things they never would. And so in that sense, if we can stretch that notion of what social media is, I think that art has given a real platform for artists, and they've grabbed it. In every form, people have grabbed it, and that it's been super exciting. And the one thing I hope we will carry into the future, once this pandemic ends, which I truly believe it will at some point end, is that we continue to make art accessible in these ways. But someone's got to pay for something at some point because artists are not making any money right now, and there are no jobs. So it's a very stressed and difficult and exciting moment all at once.
Right. Professor Rebecca, that same question to you, your thoughts on it.
Well, I would completely agree with everything Carol just said, but I also think that social media has provided a really great way for artists and students within institutions and outside of institutions to organize critique of institutions. So that's kind of going back to earlier things that we said, but I think that the ability of social media to allow a kind of flattening of hierarchies in terms of who can be heard and who can be heard by a community of like-minded people. There's some dangers to that too, but there are also some really great opportunities in terms of people being able to make their critiques of institutions heard.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Professor Rebecca Zorach, for joining us from Chicago, Professor Carol Becker for joining us from New York. It was a pleasure talking to you both and hearing your insight on this very important issue. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.